The book I have in my hand, which I think will be in the bookstores next week or the week after, is dedicated to Michael Gorbachev. Let me read you the dedication. To Michael Gorbachev, whose perestroika opened... Can you hear me now? I hate these things. Can you hear me now? I'll try again. To Michael Gorbachev, whose perestroika opened the windows to the vision of the future in the United States, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union. My wife thought that was a very bad dedication because she said, before that book comes out, he'll be out of office. He's not yet out of office, and it doesn't make any difference anyway, because what he's done has changed this century and changed the next century even more. He will be out of office soon enough, and so will Yeltsin, and their successors won't be able to achieve what he had as his goal in this century at all, because the change that has to take place in Russia, as well as in Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, Hungary, is too radical a change to occur quickly. They don't have the experience, they don't have the learning required to make the changes. It will happen in the next century, but will not be done in Gorbachev's time or Yeltsin's time, or perhaps even in their immediate successors. The title of this book is Haves Without Have-Nots, and the subtitle is Essays for the 21st Century on Democracy and Socialism. The longest essay in the book, the first essay, entitled The End of the Conflict Between Capitalism and Communism, was based on a one-week seminar that I did in Aspen in the summer of 1989. That's 12 hours of discussion and many pages of reading. And I don't think it's possible to summarize that briefly. So I'm going to do something else. I tried to summarize it in a lecture I gave a couple of weeks ago at Boulder, Colorado, to the World Affairs Council there. Wrote a long lecture, took more than an hour to deliver. I don't think it was very successful. The seminar, by the way, occurred in August of 1989. That was before the Berlin Wall toppled down. Hence, we then still faced the question, which we don't face any longer, whether or not the future contained the coexistence of the Western democracies and their kind of capitalism and the Soviet Union's communism, or whether instead of coexistence, we had to have reform, had to have replacement instead of reform. I think the issue now is clear. It is no longer reform, it's replacement. What I'm going to try to do tonight is this. I'm going to hit the high spots of that seminar, the main things that the participants, including me, learned in the course of the whole week, and I hope I can do that briefly enough so that you will have time to ask questions. Let me begin by telling you how our misuse of words clouds our minds and confuses us in trying to understand what has happened, is happening, and both will and should happen in the next century. I'm guilty of the misuse of words. I wrote that, what you have on the table with you, that lexicon of basic terms, I wrote before the seminar. I learned in the seminar the incorrectness of some of those statements. I'm going to correct them right now. For example, the title of the seminar itself was wrong. It said the end of the conflict between capitalism and communism. But capitalism and communism are not opposed. That's totally incorrect. If you were to state that more precisely, you'd say the end of the conflict between private property capitalism and state capitalism. For all that in the Soviet Union until recently, and still persists to some extent, you have the state ownership of all the means of production and the state operation of all the means of production. Whereas in the Western states, you have private property capitalism with a market economy and free enterprise. That's the opposition between private property capitalism and state capitalism. But another important word that is misused is the word socialism. In this country, unfortunately, I would gather that 90% of our people, or 99% of our people, think that socialism is opposed to capitalism. And that is not the case at all. Socialism we make the mistake of thinking that socialism is a bad word and identify it with communism. That is not the case. There is no conflict at all between capitalism and socialism, as there's no conflict between socialism and democracy. In fact, as you will see in the course of this evening, socialism and democracy are inseparable. They're twin faces of the same ideal. Another misuse of words on my part, which I'd like to correct. I should know better. I do know better now. The communism is to speak of communism as a form of socialism. It is not a form of socialism, because socialism, like democracy, is an ideal. And when you have an ideal, the various theories of it talk about the means for achieving it. For example, democracy involves plurality of parties, private associations, universal suffrage. These are the means to achieving democracy. Well, socialism is an ideal also, and the two means for it, might be means for achieving it, are private property, enterprise, free enterprise economy, and a state ownership of the means of production. And the trouble with Marx is, and I'll try to explain how he made the mistake, is he thought he was a socialist before he was a capitalist, before he was a communist. He talked about, in the Communist Manifesto, he talks about various other forms of socialism in his day, but he defines communism as the most scientific form of socialism, and defines capitalism communism in one sentence: the abolition of private property, which he means the abolition of the private ownership of the means of production. Well, if you abolish the private ownership of the means of production, all you have left is state ownership of the means of production, and that is what communism is. But socialism, like democracy, is an end, not a means, an idea to be realized in various ways. Marx's chief error, I think, it lies in the abolition of private ownership of the means of production. I'll explain that error in a moment. That's the essence of communism. Therefore, he chose the wrong means. Socialism was his ideal. But communism, or the abolition of state, communism was identical with state capitalism, is the wrong means to achieve socialism. The right means for achieving it is, as I think the world is beginning to realize, is private property capitalism, the market economy, and free enterprise. Let me explain the title of this book. Haves without have-nots really explains the two forms of this ideal. Political haves without have-nots is democracy. Economic haves without have-nots is socialism. I don't think most people realize how very, very recent both socialism and democracy are. For example, the first in the whole 25 centuries of Western thought, the first great political philosopher to say that democracy is the ideal, perfectly just form of government is John Stuart Mill in 1863. In this country, democracy came into existence in 1964. 1964 is the date of the 24th Amendment, which abolished the poll tax. Up to that time, we didn't have universal suffrage. The poor were disfranchised. So the first step toward a democratic constitution, the first step that made the amendments to the post-Civil War amendments. The 19th Amendment was the Women's Suffrage Amendment, and the 24th Amendment, which is 1964. Socialism is very recent. You're all too young to remember this, because I'm sure that I'm one of the few people in this room that remembers the first decade of the century. I remember in 1910, my father and, 1910, 1912, my father and my uncle were not going to vote for Teddy Roosevelt when we ran on the because he was a socialist. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt is the first candidate of a major party for the government, for the President of the United States, who was a socialist. In 1910, he gave a magnificent speech in Kansas called The New Nationalism. In that speech, he said in so many words, I will be called a communist agitator. He should have said socialist, not communist, because I think that property rights are secondary to human rights. And in that same speech, he said, we surround most of the working men in this country with conditions of life that prevent them from being good citizens. Now, you have to know what that means. Again, you're not old enough to know that the American working man in the first decade of the century worked 12 hours a day and 7 days a week. The first plank in the Progressive Party platform of 1912 was 1 day's rest in 7 for all working men. 1 day's rest in 7. As late as 1928 in this country, Big Steel in Pittsburgh was enjoined by the United States government from running the mills on 2 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. That was 1928. So I don't think any of us realized what the life of the working man was at the beginning of the century. And in his Progressive Party platform of 1912, he adopted almost all the measures that Marx had proposed for a gradual socialization of the economy, the income tax, the inheritance tax, free public schools, and so on. If you were to read the platform of the Progressive Party in 1912, you would find most of the measures that Wilson adopted, the inheritance tax and the income tax, most of the measures of the New Deal of FDR, most of the things that Truman did, all anticipated in 1912 by Teddy Roosevelt, our first socialist in this country. Now, I'd like to turn to some other preliminaries. Let me see if I can explain why I think that democracy and socialism are two faces of the same ideal in terms of the meaning of haves and have-nots. Equality is a very recent idea. Freedom is the essence of Republican government, but equality is the essence of democracy. Now, in a democracy, you have political equality in the sense that, with the exception of infants below the age of consent, of persons in asylums for mental incompetence, and criminals in prison for felonious crimes, all human beings now are enfranchised. They all are political haves. They have political liberty in the sense of that means that they govern with their own consent and with a voice in their own government. They have a certain amount of political power. But some citizens in public office, for the time, have more power than citizens out of public office. So that among the haves there are have-mores and have-lesses. And that's where you should be, by the way. Egalitarian democracy is wrong. Simple haves, it's not, but a non-democratic society, as England was, let's say, in the beginning of the 19th century, when 10% of the population was franchised and 90% would have not politically, because it was the second and third reform bill that finally extended women's suffrage in England came very late, as late as in this country, or even later. So that you understand that democracy consists of all political haves, not egalitarian, with some having more power, some having less, justified they have more by the duties or obligations they have to perform. A citizen in public office has more political activities to perform than the citizen not in public office, and therefore has more political power. Now, socialism is exactly the same thing in the economic order. A society in which there's economic equality and avoids egalitarianism is a society in which the right to a decent livelihood is secured for all. We're very far from this in this country now. In fact, probably no country in the world, except perhaps Sweden, is socialist to the extent of having all haves. I would guess that 1/3 of our population is deprived, seriously deprived, and are have-nots a decent livelihood is not secured for them. And among the haves, if we had a society in which there were all haves and no have-nots, no deprived, no destitute persons, no street people, no one outside the, shall I say, the pale of a decent livelihood, there'd be have-mores and have-lesses. Why? Just as in the case of the political thing, not egalitarian, because some persons in the economy contribute more to the general economic welfare than others, and therefore they have more, and have-lesses are still haves. So you have a non-egalitarian equality. There's one other fact I think that's important to remember, and that is that only an effective market economy can produce enough consumer goods and services to provide a decent livelihood for all human beings. Let me be sure that you understand that I'm not talking about money at all. Here are the elements of a decent livelihood. A decent supply of the means of subsistence, living and working conditions conducive to health, medical care, opportunities for access to the pleasures of sense, as well as to the pleasures of play and aesthetic pleasures, opportunities for access to the goods of the mind through educational facilities in youth and adult life, and enough free time from subsistence work, both in youth and adult life, to take full advantage of these opportunities. That is a decent livelihood. And that is something that everyone has, I think, a natural human right to. Let me add one other thing here. There is no middle ground between these alternatives. On the one hand, a pluralistic society with competing political parties, decentralized private property capitalism, private economic associations, free enterprise, and a market economy. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, one-party rule, centralized state capitalism, no private economic associations, no free enterprise, no market economy. Between those two extremes, there is no middle ground, one or the other. And that is exactly what the struggle is going on in Europe today. Now, how to go from one of those to the other is very difficult indeed. Let me take a moment more on one other piece of background. There are two authors. I think all the mistakes that happen in our lives are failures to read the right books. There are two authors that Karl Marx, though he spent most of his life in the British Library, never read. John Locke's second treatise on civil government, and Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, written in 1835. Locke's book was written in 1783. In that book, chapter 5 is the labor theory of property. If Marx had read Locke's analysis of the labor theory of property, he wouldn't have made the mistake of making the central vision he had, the labor theory of value. It's a difficult chapter. The point is that, as Locke says, when all the world was America, forgetting the Indians were here, no one was here, that was the land and all its results were common, and the people that came to this country from Europe appropriated that property by their labor. According to the basic point of the labor theory of value, is that all the primary appropriations out of the common are by working one's muscles or one's mind, and when one mixes one's work, labor by either mind or muscle, with the common, one rightfully appropriates the result. Hence a man who lassos a horse in the wild, tames him, owns that horse. A man who takes a plot of land and fences it, and then makes some simple instruments that for hoeing it and furrowing it, owns, properly appropriates the goods he has produced. And there's a passage that I want to read you. I read this chapter in Locke many times before I found this passage and saw its significance. Locke says in this one sentence, "Thus, The grass my horse has bit, the turfs my servant has cut, and the ore I have digged in any place, where I have a right to them in common with others, become my property without the assignation or consent of anybody. I thought the word that bothered me was the word servant. Let me change the word servant to employee, and let me tell you a simple story. Here's Mr. Brown, who has this little plot of land, a horse, the fenced-in farm, and the farm implements. Standing at the fence one day, and a journeyman worker comes with a bag of clothes on his back, and Brown says to Smith, the man that's walking by, "Would you like to work for me?" And the Smith inquires about what he'd get for a week's work, and Brown says, "Food and lodging, and this amount of the commodities we produce." This employee, let's call him servant, agrees to this simple wage contract. In that next week, beginning Monday, Brown, the owner of the land, the horse, the implements, spends his whole week reading Shakespeare. Does not a stroke of work at all. Smith works with Brown's tools. At the end of the week, Brown pays Smith what he owed him, and he walks off, and all the rest of the property is Brown's. The question is, has Brown rightfully earned that residue of what is left when he's paid Smith off according to the contract? The answer is yes. If so, the non-working capitalist has rightfully earned without working himself. Because in that week he's done not an ounce of work. He's read Shakespeare all week. What is his right to what he's earned? Because he has put his capital to work. His capital are instruments of production. If he hadn't put them to work, there wouldn't no wealth would be produced. The worker that he's hired has used his capital in doing that work. He's paid off, and that is earned increment, not unearned increment. The only unearned increment that you can have is a gift. The United States income tax law is thoroughly Marxist. It calls the earnings of capital unearned increment. That's exactly what Marx calls them. Not unearned at all. Nothing better in the world to be in a capitalist economy than to be a capitalist who doesn't work at all, but has the capital, puts his capital to work to produce wealth. The other great writer that Marx missed is even more important, and that is Alex de Tocqueville, who came to the United States in 1835, wrote a book called Democracy in America, and defined democracy in illustration, because we didn't have any democracy in 1835. It was the period of Jackson, but much more than half the population was disfranchised, and the working conditions were miserable. But what Tocqueville saw in America, as compared to feudal France that he left behind, was that this country was striving tending toward universal equality of conditions. And he defined democracy as that new tendency in the world that was driving for universal equality of conditions. Universal equality of conditions, both economic and political. And he said, in his marvelous preface, that he thought that God's providence was bringing this to the world, and it would sweep the world in the course of the next century. But he also predicted that this striving for universal equality of conditions might, should I say, detract from freedom. Because he said, if the central government paternalistically tries to provide that universal equality of conditions for the people who passively receive it, that centralization of both political and economic power in the central government will produce a tyranny, an invasion of freedom, worse than ever has happened in the world. Let me read you the passage in which he says this. I think, then, he says, that the species of oppression by which democratic nations are menaced is unlike anything which has ever existed in the world before. Our contemporaries will find no prototype of it in their memories. I looked in vain for an expression which will accurately convey the whole of the idea formed of it. The old word despotism and tyranny are inappropriate. The thing itself is new. Since I cannot name it, I must attempt to define it. The name came into existence in the 20th century. The name he was looking for didn't have totalitarianism. A totalitarian society is one in which all power, economic and political, is concentrated in the apparatus of the state, in the central government. What was, and this is what Tocqueville thought would happen in any nation that was striving for equality of conditions. What remedy did he propose? What remedy did he propose to avoid this? To avoid this invasion of freedom by equality? Pluralism. He said that before Louis XIV, the reason why there was no great despotism in France is because all the lords and nobles, the marquises, the barons, the earls, the viscounts, and so forth, each had their own estates, and they were secondary agents of government. The king was only one of those in the feudal hierarchy. And what Louis XIV did, Tocqueville knew, shall I say, increase his despotism, was to have all the nobles leave their estates and serve him at Versailles. By doing that, he concentrated the power in himself. Now, said Tocqueville, in order to prevent that from happening in America or anywhere else in the world, you have to have secondary agencies of government, private corporations, you have to have pluralism of private associations. And that, of course, is what we have in as opposed to a totalitarian state. But you can't have that. You can't have a plurality of private associations, corporations with profit and non-profit, unless you have the private ownership of capital. Now, Tocqueville's statement is exactly my statement. A pluralistic society with all haves, no have-nots, and with some that have more and some that have less, deservedly because of what they do, because of what they're responsible for doing, then you will have, I think, a just society, both politically and economically. You may say to me, where does the right for decent livelihood, where does that right come from? It's not mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. Let me pause for a moment about the Declaration, which, by the way, Lincoln understood full well and always said about it that it was not a description of what was going on at the time it was written, but a pledge for the future, and it's still a pledge for the future. In that famous second paragraph, it says that we are all endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, since he said among these, obviously there are other rights that he didn't mention. Let me expand the sentence. Jefferson was controlled by a rhetorical style there. Let me expand it precisely. These rights include life, liberty, and anything else that anyone needs, not wants, needs, in order to pursue happiness, which means lead a decent human life. In that last clause, in addition to life and liberty, is the right to a decent livelihood. No one can pursue happiness. No one can lead shall I say, make a good life for himself, thoroughly deprived economically. You know that as well as I know it. And it is that right which we have yet to enact in this country, either by a constitutional amendment or by positive legislation. I think probably positive legislation is a better way of doing it. Now let me tell you what I've done. Marx's error is the labor theory of value. Marx's error is saying that all wealth is produced not by human labor, but all by human labor, whether it's living labor or congealed labor. He thought the machinery was congealed labor. Therefore, the non-working capitalist has a thoroughly unearned increment by exploiting the worker. Now, what did he mean by that? Because at his time, in England, which he was acquainted with, know Germany as well, bourgeois capitalism, less than 10% of the population owned all the means of production, and the iron law of wages operated. In order to increase their profits, they worked the laborer 10, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and paid him subsistence wages, which meant just enough to keep him alive and reproducing another generation of laborers to the labor pool. That's the error that Marx made, was in thinking that the cure for that was to abolish private property. Our debt to Marx, the right-wing conservatives of the party think that Marx is entirely right. Our American conservatives think that Marx is entirely wrong. They're both wrong. Marx is partly right and partly wrong. We owe two debts to him, which I want to be sure you understand. The first debt is that he, more than anybody else in the 19th century, called attention to the misery of the working class under bourgeois capitalism and the iron law of wages. When labor was a commodity, these people, the proletariat, were wage slaves. By the way, I have found passages in Tocqueville and an American educator by the name of Horace Mann that describe the conditions of workers in the factories of Massachusetts and in Tocqueville and also in the factories in New York that thoroughly confirm Marx's statement about the misery of the working class. And in my Aspen seminar, when I asked the executives around the table, most of them chairmen of the board, or senior vice presidents, presidents of corporations, whether they would like to be a working man under 19th century conditions, they all said no. Perfectly. Let me ask you the question. Can anyone gainsay the truth in the insight that the misery of the working class in the 19th century and the mistreatment of the proletariat labor by the bourgeois capitalists of that era and in the first decades of this century was a problem that justice required mankind to solve? The answer, obviously, no one can say that. Can anyone gainsay the truth in the insight that class divisions, class conflicts, and class warfare, which have been going on in civilized societies from the very beginning, are a social evil that prudence required mankind to remedy? I think that's obvious also. Must not everyone who answers these questions affirmatively also acknowledge their indebtedness to Marx and Lenin for devoting all their efforts to putting these matters at the top of mankind's agenda, as well as indebtedness to them for whatever is sound in their proposals for dealing with them? The second debt is the debt about classes societies. By the way, Marx did not, in the manifesto, his statement that history, all history is history of class conflicts. He didn't invent that. Plato, in the 5th century BC, said that there always are two cities: the city of the rich, the city of the poor, and they're forever at war with one another. Toynbee, in his great 11-volume work on study of history, said that all civilizations that have failed because of both class and war. The class conflicts within the society and the conflicts between one society and another. So that I would say that our second debt, our first unquestionable debt to Marx himself and the Communist Manifesto, is this insistence we must do something about the misery of the working class. What he proposed was the wrong thing to do, but we must do the right thing there. And the second point is the point about class conflict. Let me, since I'd like to give you as much time to ask questions, but let me end with this observation. If you take all human societies from 6,000 years ago, or even 20,000 years ago, go back to the earliest cities in the Mesopotamia, down to the end of the 19th century, this fact is obvious. In all those societies, there was a very small privileged majority and a very large oppressed, very, very small privileged minority and a very large oppressed majority. Any way you look, that is the case. Beginning in this century, for the first time in this century, and more so in the last 40 years than the first 50 years of the century. We now have a privileged majority and some oppressed minorities. Too large perhaps, but we've gone over the hill to a privileged majority. The majority of our population are haves, politically and economically. The minorities are have-nots. Now, that motion will go on to the next century in which we will have no oppressed minorities at all, and no class conflicts. And it seems to me that is the goal that we should all be looking for, not only in the Soviet Union, not only in the states of Eastern Europe, but in China and in the United States. It's a long way to go, but we have a whole century to do it. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the time we have left this evening, we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. And please make the questions as brief as possible, and please make them questions. Sir, right here.
Yes, Dr. Adler, you spoke about income taxes in a somewhat pejorative manner. What
No, I didn't.
State
I wasn't pejorative about income taxes. I was saying only that to talk about the earnings of the dividends on equities, of owning shares of capital, calling that unearned increment is just absolutely wrong. It's perfectly, the only unearned increment is a gift. And what you get on the dividends of your capital holdings is not a gift. It's earned. Not by your work, your wages and salary are what your muscles and mind do, but when you put capital to work to produce wealth, you earn it. That's all I said. Yes.
Did you have another part to that question, sir? Okay. Yes, sir.
Dr. Adler, how do you see the rise of nationalism as possibly disrupting your view of the future as far as...
It's worse than nationalism. It's worse.
Would you please describe how the concept of nationalism will affect your concept of the future?
It doesn't bear on what we're saying here. It has to do with the struggle in all these countries to remain united, to federate. In all these countries of Europe now, this is one of Gorbachev's chief problems, is tribalism. Worse than nationalism. Nationalism is a high form of tribalism. The notion, let me put it, the ideal again that nationalism is against is the notion that there are foreigners. There are no foreigners in the human race. We're all brothers. And nationalism that divides one group of people from another, or the tribalism, which is even worse, is, I think, the enemy of any progress whatsoever.
Sir, in the back, please.
How can you justify the government control over
How do you justify the government control over health care in terms of what you've been describing?
Abraham Lincoln, I think, again, agreeing with de Tocqueville on pluralism, said, the government should do for the people only that which the people cannot do for themselves, either individually or collectively in their private associations. Now, if the people, in their individually or collectively in their private associations, could handle the health problem, the government wouldn't have to step in. But obviously, there's a case in which health care is something that is not effectively handled by individuals themselves, or individually or collectively. That justifies, as I said, government should do for the people only that which they can't do for themselves.
Sir, there are many who do.
Dr. Adler, how do you feel this equalization will come about so that the oppressed, underprivileged people by the next century will have the equality?
How will the equality of the next century come about?
Well, just think of the measures that the redistributive taxes, the use of the welfare system. By the way, a decent livelihood can be had three ways. by welfare payments to those who are unable to earn a living, by wages and salaries, and by the earnings of capital, dividends on capital. And obviously, if you want to reduce the welfare system to the minimum, you've got to provide a decent livelihood is earned either by labor, by mind and muscle, or by the workings of dividends on your capital. I would say that up until the time of Reagan and Bush, we went forward. We're going backward in the last 10 years. We've increased the number of have-nots in this country quite remarkably in the last 10 years. The fundamental entitlements have not been properly taken care of. But if you looked at the progress of this country from 1900 to the present day, we have gradually socialized. In fact, if we hadn't socialized our capitalism in the 20s and 30s, we wouldn't be working at all today. So that I think the progress is great. The next step is just simply one step further. But I do think that the recognition of this fundamental right, the right to a decent livelihood, and secured by legislation, is indispensable to the progress.
I have a question.
Sir, we'll get to you in a second, please. Sir, ma'am. Would you please comment on the unions in our country today? Is there still a need for them?
Less and less. They were very important at the beginning of the century. I would like to have you, I know you can't get your hands on it, but the early labor papers, the papers that were written in 1828 and 1835 on the formation of unions, shows how important unions were at the time of our bourgeois capitalism in this country. Actually, unions are less and less effective, and that is they were that. I had Walter Reuther in my seminar at Aspen at a time when Walter was bargaining with represented United Auto Workers, was bargaining with General Motors, and at that time, General Motors was offering the union stock options, and Walter turned it down. And I said, why do you turn down the offer of stock options? He said, because the union would have nothing to do. We'd be on the side of the capitalists. I think it was a perfectly honest answer, but wrong.
Sir.
Dr. Adler, for 200 years, liberty has been the great American shibboleth. Are liberty and equality antithetical? And if so, is equality the new virtue?
No.
Are liberty and equality antithetical, and if so, is equality the new virtue?
No. The libertarian and the egalitarian are in opposition. The libertarian wants unlimited liberty. The egalitarian wants more equality than is right. Let me give you the rule. If justice, which is the crowning idea here, regulates both liberty and equality, they're not in conflict. If no one has any more freedom than he can use justly, which means use without, shall I say, hurting anybody else. And if everyone has as much equality as they justly deserve, no more or no less than that, then there's no conflict at all between liberty and equality. And I would think in a pluralistic society, that's exactly what Toffel is saying, that we can achieve equality without in any way detracting from liberty.
Sir.
Dr. Adler, we license cats, dogs, cars, houses, marriages, but we don't license birth. It seems to me that in the future, at some point, we've got to put in some kind of regulation so that children are licensed in the sense that you should be able to have so many people. If you look at the planet, there are too many people on this planet. A country like China can never achieve our wealth. It's impossible. How do you?
Well, they've tried to limit the population in China.
The question was on how to limit the number of children.
There are pills.
Yes, ma'am. How would you advise President Gorbachev today as to how to deal with Boris Yeltsin and what economic steps would be needed in the Soviet Union?
Gorbachev has two problems, not one. Yeltsin has only one problem, namely how to replace totalitarian communism with private enterprise, private property, market economy. That's a difficult enough problem for both of them. But Gorbachev, in addition to having the same problem, has the problem of the Soviet Union, has the problem that Lincoln had when the South seceded from the Union. And there you have this these form of. I'm not concerned with the Baltic provinces now because those are conquered provinces. I'm talking about the other republics in the USSR, and that's a very difficult problem. I think that is what Gorbachev is likely to fail on, and Yeltsin being the president of the Russian Republic doesn't have that problem.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Point out that the state of the nation is that we have 1/3 have-nots and 2/3 have. What is the basis for your optimism that the haves will use their common political and economic power to have-nots?
If there are 2/3 haves and 1/3 have-nots, what causes you to be optimistic that the haves will help the have-nots to become haves?
You know that during the first two administrations of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, this country had lots of have-nots, and the country approved. He fought the people he called economic royalists. They called him a socialist or a communist. He called them economic royalists, and he won for the most part. He didn't. In 1943, he and Wallace proposed a Bill of Economic Rights. Unfortunately, he didn't succeed in getting that bill enacted. But all the reforms of Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, and Truman are reforms that the American electorate, with a majority of haves and a minority of have-nots, put through. So that in the course of, so we get to Reagan, when we go backwards again. The country really moves steadily forward with a diminution, more socialization of the economy. So I have no difficulty about seeing that the American political process, except for one thing which I worry about, that's television. Because I think that television has ruined politics in America entirely. We may never have a good president of the United States again, because getting elected on television is an actor.
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Adler, since you have devoted your life to education, what can we do in an immediate sense for the education system in our country?
What can we do in an immediate sense for the educational system in our country?
Nothing. It has gotten steadily worse, and it's getting worse all the time. As you know, I've, for the last 10 years, tried to reform the schools. This Paideia project of mine. We now have about 125 Paideia schools in the United States. But 125 schools in the United States that are moving in the right direction is less than a drop in the bucket There are 18,000 school districts in this country. I think the possibility of effective educational reform is again something for the next century. It won't happen in this century. And all kinds of things have to happen. We've got to get rid of those test scores. The test scores measure nothing significant at all. They measure the child's ability to get through school, not the amount of learning he's had. But I hate to talk about education. I think it's a dull subject.
Yes, sir. Yes.
I was wondering, Dr. Adler, within the words, the way that you have defined it, it seems like there seems to be new definitions for something. And I was wondering to what historical facts you attribute some of the misunderstanding regarding the terms that you have described here. And in particular, I wanted to know how does the theory and the term of justice fit within this, particularly Rawlsian theory of justice. How does that fit with overall?
Can you repeat?
He says with the new definitions that are found in the lexicon that you provided today, what historical context do you put some of the definitions in? He's particularly concerned about the concept of justice, the Rawlsian theory of justice.
I'm not concerned with Rawls at all, because I think Rawls has an incorrect theory of justice. Justice is only mentioned in passing. I said at the beginning of the lecture that I wrote that dictionary for the use of my seminar before the seminar, and I think some of the phrases in there are incorrect. But I think that is a correct use of most of those terms. But justice is not there at all. And let me just say that, suffice it that you understand that justice consists in treating equals equally and unequals unequally, working for, not against, the common good, and securing all human, unalienable, and natural rights. That's all that justice is. Difficult sometimes to see. People who say, how can you handle a difficult term like justice? What they really mean is, it's not hard to say what justice is. It's very hard to say whether this is just or unjust. It's not hard to say what truth is. What definition of truth is easy. It's very difficult to say by what criteria do I judge this proposition to be true. They don't separate those two questions. The difficulties about justice are not difficult with the definition at all. The concept is a very simple concept. The difficulty is determining in this particular case, is this a just measure or is this an unjust measure? What justice is, as I say, is simply defined.
Yes, ma'am, there. In blue.
Pardon me?
I'm a little confused about the idea of class struggle. With human nature as it is, are you suggesting that there will be a time when there won't be class struggle?
Yes.
Are you suggesting that there will be a time when there will not be class struggle?
If Marx and Plato and Toynbee are right, the history of human societies from the beginning to the present day has been a history of class struggles, the haves against the have-nots, the slaves against the masters, the feudal serfs against their lords, the proletariat against the factory owners, and so forth. I think that is the first great epoch in history. But I don't think that history, I think what's ahead of us in the next century too is the second epoch, is a classless establishment. No, if I'm correct, that the future holds, the bright hope of the future is a society of all haves with no have-nots. You will have a society without any class. It'll be a second great epoch in human history. We've just finished, we're finishing in this century the first great epoch. The second one is still ahead of us.
If you heard Mr. Pinola's introduction, and you know what Dr. Adler's philosophy is in terms of work, because of that, he is going to take a red-eye special back to Chicago tonight to have a presentation at lunch tomorrow. So we're going to have time for just one.
Yes?
We have time for just one more question, I believe, if we have our ears left before Mr. Pinola comes back to close the program. Yes, ma'am, right there, please.
Sorry. I wanted to ask you, sir, when you were on the TV with William Buckley, your last statement in the a couple weeks ago was in the year 2000, there would be one world religion.
In that, you want to answer?
I'm sorry, I was playing with this and I didn't even hear the question myself.
I'll tell you. The question is, you're referring to a program, and I was out with Bill Buckley on a book I wrote last fall, published last fall, called Truth and Religion. And in that program, there was a question about, can we look forward to a one world religion? Matter of fact, Toynbee predicted that was going to happen. I think that's very unlikely. I think truth and religion is a very difficult subject, and it has nothing to do with the subject of this evening.